This dress is my favourite thing I have ever made. Ever. It's made from this Simplicity 8248 pattern, and it's a reprint of a 1930s dress. Now, these can be a bit hit and miss, so when I started making this dress, I was a little bit nervous about how it was going to turn out.
I began by cutting out the tissue pattern pieces. I cut a size 14 because I'm between a 12 and a 14 on the size guide, and I always find it easier to make clothes smaller if they turn out too big than the other way around. As this was my first time making this pattern and I was a bit suspicious about how it would turn out, I used an inexpensive craft cotton from my stash to make this dress. It has this Art Deco style motif, which I thought would be perfect for the 1930s. As I often do to save energy, I roughly cut around the pattern pieces once they were pinned on so I could trim them up later while sitting down. Only, as craft cotton is generally on the narrow side and I only had a few meters of this fabric, I couldn't get the skirt pieces out of the fabric I had, so this called for a little bit of piecing. I generally don't mind doing this, as in the past when fabric was very expensive and in short supply, people of all classes did this all the time. I tried my best to match the pattern so it was less obvious, then cut my skirt pieces out. I transferred all the markings using a chalk pencil before carefully refolding the pattern pieces to keep them for later. Yes, I am that person.
Okay, so I have cut out and marked up all my pattern pieces now, so these are ready to go. I'm going to overlock all the raw edges because while this quilting cotton is quite firmly woven, I do want this to be like a washing dress, so I'm going to overlock it and then everything should be nice and secure. I did have to piece the corners of my skirt panels. You can just about see it on the camera there. Not really the end of the world. Also quite a 1930s thing to do because, of course, before we had the whole make, do, amend movement, we had the Great Depression, which wasn't as bad in Britain as it was in the States, but it was still a really tough time for a lot of people. So, you know, piecing is period, as usual. So this pattern, Simplicity 8248, doesn't have a lengthen and shorten line on the torso, which might be an issue for little old me, possibly going to be too long there, but as it is kind of a blousey style, I might get away with it. I also haven't decided what colour I want the white trim equivalent on my dress to be. That is sort of dependent on the fabrics I have in stash. I might just do it in white, that's very 1930s, but then I'm not sure how white will look with this fabric because it's got quite a taupe sort of background. This is one of the pocket pieces, so you can kind of see there is a little bit of white in there, but the background fabric is actually more of like a fawny, taupey kind of colour, so I don't know how well white is going to work with that. I don't have much sort of in the way of cream, so yeah, I need to think about that one. But in the meantime, I'm going to double check the instructions to check how this thing goes together. I think I know, but you never know. Sometimes these big four patterns, they throw something weird in there. So I'm going to double check the instructions and then I'm going to get my overlocker out and start overlocking all my raw edges.
I like to overlock around each pattern piece individually before I start sewing up because this firstly prevents things starting to unravel as you sew, but it also makes things easier to alter at a later date. I thread the overlocker threads back on themselves to stop them unraveling, and then it's time to start sewing. As usual, I start with the darts. This time they're only in the skirt as the bodice is shaped with gathers. I also do the stay stitching around the neckline as I haven't overlocked this edge because the raw edges will be enclosed by the collar. I save time and energy by batching similar tasks together, so I also skip ahead in the instructions at this point and put the pleats in the sleeves that will give it that 1930s structured puff shape. Everything then gets a good press. I pin the pleats in place at the sleeve hem to tack down later and use my tailor's ham to press the darts into a curved shape. I tie off the threads at the point of my dart to stop them unravelling. I could reverse instead, but that can create bulk, and as these darts were in the skirt and pointing at my crotch, I wanted them to be as subtle as possible. I then began work on the facing for the back neck opening. This needed to be reinforced with interfacing, and I wanted to use sew-in interfacing as it stands up to repeated washing better. I tried to be clever here and create a lovely neat finish to the facing by bagging it out. So I put the two pieces right sides together and machined around the edges. Again, batching my tasks, I also reinforced the collar with interfacing by sandwiching it between the upper and lower halves of each collar piece, and then I joined the two patch pocket pieces right sides together so that they too could be bagged out. I then returned to the facing piece and began notching the corners and grading away the interfacing in the seam allowances to be able to turn it right side out neatly. Only, as I turned the seams, the interfacing frayed out and came completely apart from the main facing piece. Back to the drawing board. I unpicked all of that and just turned the seam allowances of the main fabric over the now trimmed down piece of interfacing and top stitched it in place. Not as neat, but it'll be on the inside anyway, so who cares? Next came grading for the collar and notching the curves of the pockets before they were turned right sides out and pressed carefully so the seam sat exactly around the edges. I had decided to use some of this natural, which I think means unbleached, cotton bias tape that I had left over from my little Dorrit project as the binding details, so I pinned it in place along the top of the pockets. It was tricky to get it to go nicely around that V shape in the centre of each pocket, and there weren't really directions in the pattern for what to do with the binding at the edge of the pocket, so I did what I thought was best. Don't do what I did, I was wrong. I machined the binding in place, realised my mistake at the edges, so unpicked it and tried again. This time I just left the excess binding to be hand-stitched in place later. I also bound the edges of the collar pieces, carefully easing the binding around the curves. I could then fold the binding around to the wrong side and press it in place and use some steam to get rid of any puckers. I pinned the binding ready to be hand sewn, but again batching my tasks, I put that to one side and worked on pressing the binding on the pockets. I had to notch into that little V to get it to turn nicely, not mentioned in the instructions by the way, but it really helped. I then spent ages trying to get the edges to look presentable. I tried folding in the excess first before folding it over, which seemed to work the best, but it was really fiddly and I had to grade out some of the bulk, which made the seam allowances tiny and difficult to work with. But I finally got it to look decent, and so I pinned it in place and moved on to the hand sewing. I used very tiny felling stitches to sew the binding down on the wrong side. I chose this over a slip stitch because I knew this dress was going to be washed a lot and pockets get a lot of wear, so I needed the stitching to be strong. However, for the collar, I used a slip stitch. It's not so much of a high friction area, so it doesn't need to be as strong. A slip stitch is also quicker, so maybe I was just bored with hand sewing that day. With all the components ready to go, I started actually constructing the bodice. That meant putting in the gathering stitches to join the yoke to the bodice. The gathers are just in two places over the chest and not in the middle. So I matched up the smooth sections of the seam and then pulled on the gathering threads to draw in the excess fabric between the markings on the pattern. I stroked and evenly spaced the gathers and pinned them into position before sewing the two pieces together. Then I began work on the back neck facing. I put the facing piece on the back piece right sides together and matched up the markings. I then machined along the lines that I had transferred from the pattern to indicate the opening, pivoting at the corners and rounding them off slightly to get a crisper edge when I turned it through. Now the scary part. I cut through all the layers of fabric, almost down to the stitching at the bottom of the opening, but instead of cutting up to the line, I made a sort of upside down V shape, cutting carefully into each corner. I could then begin pressing the facing around to the inside. I do this in stages, pressing one half open at a time to encourage it to lie the other way before I start forcing it through the gap. Then I flip it around to lie on the inside and begin creasing it with my fingers. I still had a few puckers at the bottom, so I turned it back around and clipped a few more threads. Literally just a few threads can make such a difference to how the fabric wants to lie. Once I'm happy that I've got it looking as smooth as possible just with finger pressing, I get my iron and begin ironing it into submission. First from the wrong side and then from the right side. Only once I am completely happy with how the fabric sits at the opening do I then go and understitch the facing in place, stitching it just to the seam allowance of the opening as far as I can towards the bottom of the slit. With the facing in, I joined the shoulder seams so I could move on to setting in the collar. I pressed the shoulder seams open, and I realised I hadn't pressed the yoke seam yet, so I did that while I had the iron out. I carefully pressed the seam towards the hem on the wrong side, avoiding the gathered sections. I then worked from the right side, carefully pressing over the gathers so I didn't accidentally press in any weird creases. Then it was time to stitch on the collar. I joined the markings overlapping the two collar halves at the centre front and slowly machine basted the collar in place inside the seam allowance. I kept my hand between the collar and the bodice of the dress to smooth out any tucks or puckers. You can see here at the centre front how the two layers of the collar overlap. I then made the collar facing by folding the pattern piece in half and pressing in place. This was a strip cut on the bias, so I could have used a shop-bought bias binding, I guess. Double checking how this all worked in the instructions, I lined up the raw edge of the bias facing with that line of basting I had just done and pinned it in position on top of the collar. I then machined everything in one go along the sewing line. I did this from the inside of the neck so I could see the sewing line which I had chalked in on the wrong side. I then clipped the curved neckline and trimmed down the seam allowance around the neck and collar so that I could turn the bias facing around to the inside and cover all of those raw edges. I first pressed the facing open over a tailor's ham to keep the curved shape of the collar, and then working from the inside, pressed and pinned the facing into position, making sure to neaten the edges of the binding. I then hand-stitched the facing in place with a herringbone, aka a catch stitch, to allow that little bit of movement needed to get the facing to shape around the curved neckline. Then I gave everything a good press over the tailor's ham, pressing the facing first of all from the right side, and then the collar into its final position. The final bit of stitching needed on the bodice before I made up the dress proper was to add the gathering stitches to the waistline. Then it was time to add the pockets to the skirt. This is of course much easier to do when the skirt front isn't attached to anything else. I matched the pockets up with the markings, pinned them in position, and then used my top stitching foot to carefully machine around the outside edge of each pocket. With the pockets on, I could make up the skirt, joining the side seams on the machine and then pressing those seams open. Then I joined the bodice side seams and pressed those open, and the bodice could be joined to the skirt. With right sides together, I matched the markings as usual and began by pinning the smooth sections together before moving on to the gathers. I pulled on the gathering threads until the bodice fitted into the skirt and stroked and evened out the gathers before pinning them in place. This was of course repeated for the back too, before the waist seam was machined in place.
Put the dress on for a fitting. Sleeves are just pinned in at the top here, and amazingly I tacked the side seam shut ready to put the zip in, and I thought to myself, oh god, now I won't be able to get it on. But I was able to get it on because I think it's too big. So as you can see, if I sort of ride it down to where it wants to sit naturally, snugly over the hips, because 1930s things do fit snugly over the hips, it's just too long. I know it's supposed to be blousy, but I mean, that is a good inch below my natural waist, and we've still got like a load of excess in there. I think it needs to sit a bit more like that, and that is just ridiculous. And it's because it's a bit wide as well, it just makes my torso look really square, which is kind of a 30s thing as well, but I'm not loving it. We've moved so that you can see a bit better what I'm talking about. I think it's too wide over the shoulders. You can see they're only approximately pinned in, these sleeves, but they are absolutely going to fall off. Like the point of my shoulder is here. So I think I need to take out some width in the shoulder and possibly through here. I think it's just a touch too wide. Yeah, you can just see, I think, as I stand here, that this is not a good look. I suppose. I think with the pattern as well, it all sort of blends in. Do really like the collar. I had to redo the collar because I did it wrong. So the collar is supposed to finish like this at the very edge of the opening, and I had mine extend past it originally because I matched up the markings, and that's what I got. Don't know if I just marked it up wrong, but yeah, I ended up having to pick it off and the facing and redo it. But yeah, I think it needs to be just a touch slimmer. It's just too blousy, so I think I might take in the side seams, and I'm definitely going to chop out some length, and I'm going to take out the width. Kind of wish I'd made a 12. This is a 14. Kind of wish I'd made a 12. We shall see. We shall see what happens. Somewhat Miss Muppety is the only way I can describe it, and I don't know how I feel about that. Cutesy little details like gathers and collars aren't generally my thing, I am discovering, but I do really like the print. I bought this print at the Knitting and Stitching show when I went a few years ago. I won tickets in an Instagram giveaway, which was very exciting, and I bought this fabric and another fabric which I'm finally hoping to get around to using 2 years later. And I wasn't sure when I started, I wasn't sure how I felt about it. I don't generally go for prints like this, but I actually think it's got that feed sack look about it, which is very 30s. It's just like a craft cotton weight, which has been actually quite nice to sew after I'm making this straight after I made the slippery satin circle skirt, so it's nice to have something with a bit of structure.
I began working on those alterations, starting by undoing the waist seam and marking on my new sewing line. While I needed to take out a lot of length in the front, I didn't need to take so much out in the back, so I had to curve the seam up in the centre front. For the side seams, I took the seam in more at the bust than at the waist, keeping the seam allowance the same at the waist but making it bigger at the bust. I moved the armholes in about 1.5 centimetres, but gradually eased them into the original sewing line at the armpit before smoothing out the curve with my pattern master. And of course the same for the back.
Okie dokie, alterations have been made. I didn't film any of that because I essentially did everything you've just seen, apart from with bigger seam allowances. So I took in 1 centimetre on each side on this seam, but I tape it in at the waist because I quite like the way the waist fits. And I took an extra centimetre, I think, out of the back length and 3 centimetres out of the front length, which you can't see. Hold on. Okay, that's better. So you can see, unfortunately, we've got the scoliosis issues happening, which I haven't bothered to fix because I'm not that bothered. But you can see now it definitely just looks less square and boxy, and the blouse is much more appropriate. Let me show you the back. Obviously, I haven't got a fastening at the top here yet, but yeah, the waistline is now parallel to the floor, which is good. Well, as parallel as it can be on me with my wonky body. But yeah, I just think it looks now more proportional to my current size. So I've got a big old chunk of seam allowance here at the waist now. I don't know if I'll leave that in or if I'll trim it off. I've marked in, can you see it? Yes, so just about. So this, where I folded it, you can just about see that purple line there. That is that is the new sewing line for the sleeve placement, which I think is just about hitting the boniest part of my shoulder there, which is where you want your sleeves to hit. So I think that's good. So I've got to put the zip in before I put the sleeves in. There was something I wanted to say about the sleeves. Oh yes, because I've altered the underarm and the sleeve armhole, I double checked to see if the sleeve would still fit. So I've marked on the sewing line for the sleeve as well, and I measured it, and it comes up about the same depending on tape measure, etc. So I think it's going to be fine. My worry is that the armhole will now be bigger than the sleeve. If the sleeve's bigger than the armhole, that's fine, you can ease it in, but we're looking at possibly 1 centimetre the other way around with the armhole being too big. If that is the case, I might pinch a bit out at the shoulder seam because I have got just a little bit of room there. So we shall see when I go to pin that in how I feel. But first things first, I have to put the zip in. And did I say this yesterday? I have no idea. I was so tired yesterday. But I'm doing a lapped zip because I really enjoyed doing it on the circle skirt I made, and you can do it in the side seam of a dress according to the Reader's Digest, so I want to try that as well as a new sort of skill on this project. So yes, let's go.
Now that I was happy with how everything fit, I removed all of my gathering stitches and pressed that new waist seam into position, again being careful of the gathers. I had intended to do a lapped zip for this dress where you sew the zip from the inside and flip it over and do some brilliant, precise stitching to catch both the seam allowance and the main fabric at the same time. But it didn't really work for me on this dress, so I sort of ended up with a hybrid half-lapped, half-railroaded zip, which isn't very pretty, so I'm not showing it to you too closely. But as I can get this dress on without undoing the zip anyway, I wasn't that bothered. With the zip in, I could begin on the sleeves. They first had to be made up, which I hadn't gone around to yet, so I joined the underarm seams on the machine and then began pressing in the hems. I narrowly turned under the overlocked edge and pressed it in place before turning the hem up again to the correct length and pressing that fold too. It looks like I didn't measure this, but I think I'm using the print of the pattern as a guide for where to press it. I was obviously feeling confident that the fabric was A, printed completely straight, and B, I'd cut it exactly on the grain. As with the facing, I stitched the hem of the sleeves in place with a herringbone stitch. I find that with tight curves like this, the movement of a herringbone stitch makes a big difference in preventing puckers and wrinkles when you turn the hem back around to the right side. With the sleeves made up, it was time to start setting them into the armhole. There's no gathering or ease-stitching in the top of this sleeve cap because of the pleats, so I simply matched up the markings with the shoulder seam and hoped everything else would fit. If you've been around on my channel for a while, you will know that I have an unusual method for setting in sleeves that I've previously made an entire video about. But the gist of it is, I always tack the sleeves together along the sewing line and I machine the sleeves in 2/2, working on the underarm with the bodice facing up, and then turning everything around to machine the sleeve head so that the inside of the sleeve is facing up. It's fiddly and time consuming, but it's the most reliable method I've found to make sure sleeves work every time. I then press the sleeve seam over a tailor's ham, making sure that the seam allowance is facing into the sleeve to make that pleat at the shoulder seam puff up a bit more. At this point, the dress is very nearly complete. The opening at the centre back needs a fastening, so I add a hook and eye, and then the dress just needs a hem. I pinned up the hem along the line suggested by the pattern, but I felt it was just too long on me and cut my legs off at a weird place. So then it was time to use my newest sewing gadget, a skirt hemmer. Many thanks to all the wonderful people in the comments who reminded me to buy one. I went for one of these that you can use on yourself, where you adjust the hemmer to the desired height, and then you can use this little puffer to blow chalk dust to make a mark on the hem. You then get a little line of chalk at the point on the hem, and you just keep doing this until you've marked all the way around the skirt.
Now the keys in the mailbox, the same as before, but no one is waiting for me anymore.
Now, if you're like me and you have an asymmetrical body, you'll end up with a hem that is parallel to the floor, but is uneven when you take the garment off. I trusted my chalk markings, but instead of cutting my hem off, I just folded it in such a way that I kept all the excess tucked inside the hem. That way, if I ever sell this dress or give it to somebody else, they can easily alter it to be even on them. I first folded the hem along the chalk lines from the hem marker and tacked close to the fold to keep them in place. To stop the visible hem stitching looking uneven, however, what I did was to fold the excess under so that it measured evenly up from the fold of the hem rather than measuring down from the raw edge. This meant in some places I turned under more than others, but the visible part of the hem is nice and even. As with most of the other hand stitching on this dress, I used a herringbone stitch to sew the hem in place. Mostly for consistency at this point, but also because I find the stitches last longer than slip stitches. As the skirt is gored, the hem is wider than the part of the skirt I was sewing it to, so I made small tucks in the hem every now and again to ease in the excess fabric. I then made sure to give those tucks and the entire hem a good press before removing my basting stitches. And then the dress was complete. And now I hope you will see why this is my favourite dress I've ever made. I was worried that it wouldn't feel glamorous and that the details would be too feminine and cutesy for my liking, but that hasn't happened at all. It's feminine, yes, but the little collar and gathered yoke, often seen on little girls' party frocks, are balanced by the boxy shoulders and the straight skirt. Somehow the addition of those styles makes it more grown up and chic. The pockets are more decorative than practical, as they barely fit my hands in, never mind my phone. And I think perhaps I shortened the back waist too much, but oh well. And of course the zip is a bit dodgy, so here I am trying to distract you as I show it to you. But if you can't tell from this shot, then I'm really not worried about it. I'm pleased with the hem thanks to my new skirt hemmer. You can see how it doesn't follow the straight of the pattern, but it looks much better on me than any previous hem I've sewn by eye. All in all, let me just push my mess a bit further out of shot. All in all, I'm so pleased with this dress. With this little 1930s series, I can honestly say I think I've finally found my personal style. Thanks for watching. See you next time.